Hi, my name is Giovanni Nogales, and I am a paralegal here at Liles Parker. Thank you for joining us at our webinar today. Today's webinar is entitled Risks Facing Your Home Health and Hospice Agencies If You Hire Someone from the OIG Exclusion List or the CMS Preclusion List. Today's speakers is Robert Liles and Paul Weidenfeld.
Thank you, Gio. Hello, Paul.
Hey, Robert, what's
It's
up?
a cold day in D.C.
Our first one.
It's a first cold day. Last week it was up to 80. Today we're down into the 30s.
Yeah.
Yep.
What's it like down in Texas, I wonder?
Poor Texas, they go from 115 to 20. So, I can only imagine. But today we're going to talk about a couple of issues that are issues that most of the folks on here don't really know a whole lot about. And frankly, with regard to the exclusion list, they are probably the least known significant risk issue that home health and hospices have. And that's why I wanted you here with us, Paul, because you're with exclusion screening. And I know that you are a national expert on exclusion issues.
Well, thank you, Robert.
So we're going to talk about preclusion as well. Now, I know these just sound like words that I'm making up. So let's kind of talk about what in the world I'm discussing. Next slide, Gio. Now let's first discuss the preclusion list. And preclusion list has only been around for a few years. In 2018, CMS proposed some new rules, essentially governing Part C and Part D payers. Now, essentially what they did is they broke off Part C and Part D from Parts A and B when it comes to credentialing and signing up and enrollment and disenrollment and the rest of it. But when they did that, they realized, well, you know what, if we're going to put Part C and Part D out there kind of on their own, we're going to have to take some kind of steps to help them protect the payer system from bad guys.
Right? That's about right. So what they're doing is basically they wanted to get out of the managed care business.
CMS.
That's right. Thank you. And and they wanted to get out of managed care, and they wanted to get out of Part D, the prescription business.
Now, that's not to say that they are discouraging Advantage.
No, in fact, they're very much encouraging it.
That's right. And the last numbers are more than 51% on the Medicare side are signed up. And in Texas, for instance, it's like 75% for Medicaid managed care.
It's the increase is almost, I don't know that it's defined exponentially, because I'm not sure that it's actually exponential, but it feels like it. It goes up 5-6% almost every year.
It does.
And if you try and CMS has really aggressively tried to pass over managed care to the insurance companies, but all aspects of it, and that's what preclusion is about.
That's right.
They're out of the credentialing business,
right?
Which means, as I think everybody on this call knows, it means that so now instead of going to CMS as being your payer, you have to go to all the different managed care entities.
And for home care and hospice, that's a big deal, because in Texas, for those of you who participate in Medicaid, that means you're going to have a number of different payers you're going to have to get credentialed with, right?
Absolutely. So Medicare has its managed care. Medicaid has its managed care.
Right.
They're called different things.
Medicare Advantage, Medicaid managed care.
Or Medicare, yes. And so they have different payers.
Right.
Although most payers will do both Medicare and Medicaid.
Well, it varies from state to state, but that's right.
But then you'd have to be credentialed both sides of that house.
So this list that we're talking about, this preclusion list, it's different than the exclusion list, as we're going to discuss, but it's basically a list of bad guys that CMS says, hey, if you're on this list, you're not going to be eligible to sign up for and enroll in Part C or Part D.
So think about it this way. So CMS still has administration over Part C and D overall.
Yes, the overall management, that's right.
That's right. And so they want to get out of the business of people having of signing up or enrollment with it. But they realized, there are some people that we would not allow in our program. And so and so they're not on an exclusion list. They're not on any particular list. And if we're not going to allow them into our program, we want those managed care entities to know that they shouldn't allow them into their program.
That's right. That's right. But it's a strange animal, this preclusion list, though, isn't it? It's really different.
And because you don't actually have access to it.
And when I say you mean
the provider,
home health and hospice agencies. Providers don't have access. That's right. That's right. Oh, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the preclusion list then is prepared to really assemble a list of what CMS considers to be bad actors.
Bad actors who are not if you're already on the OIG exclusion list, you're considered part of the preclusion list. So it's bad actors who haven't made it to the OIG exclusion list, essentially.
You can be, yes. Well, the preclusion list theoretically ought to be a lot bigger. Okay.
Right.
But who knows?
But it's ones that, as we'll see, it's ones that CMS will revoke or would have revoked.
That's right.
Wouldn't allow into the Medicare A and B program.
Mm-hmm.
And but they're not yet bad enough or been caught enough to be on the.
They haven't formally gotten in trouble,
right?
And therefore been excluded, possibly. But this whole term "bad actors" that is a term of art, and that is a term that CMS actually uses in the Federal Register, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It absolutely is.
Now, who does have access to this thing then?
So the payers, all the Part C players, Part C and Part D plans, they have access to it, and they are required to screen them, and they will push down. So that's what. So they can push down. They have the obligation to screen all of the participants in their plans, in their programs, and they push those obligations down to payers.
Yep.
But this is one that they can't push down to the players, to the actual providers. This is something that the plans themselves screen and look for.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about then how you get on the preclusion list. Next slide. There are really two basic ways, and we're going to spend a little more time on category one, which is revocation based. Okay, and then we'll talk about the second category. But the first category of people that are added to the preclusion list, okay, is this category of folks that have had their billing privileges revoked. Okay, so they've got to be a bar to their so they got to be revoked. They cannot re-enroll for so many years, and
10 years, right?
Well, up to 10 years, up to 10 years. And CMS has determined that whatever the conduct was at the bottom of this was sufficiently bad, okay, that it's not in the best interest of these people to be allowed to enroll in Part C and Part D, all right? Now, since this is revocation based, I want to talk a little bit about, okay, so what's revocation? What's the big deal for revocations? Next slide. And one thing I want to point out, I mean, these are your typical revocation actions, and I'm going to kind of keep it pretty brief on revocations because we could do a whole presentation just on revocations.
And have,
that's right. But for home health and hospices, especially, this is a big deal. You know, failure to report a change of location, failure to keep residents regular business hours. You know, those are two of the big things that result in a home health agency being revoked. And what happens is in real life, a UPIC will come by and on a random day, and you've got an official address that you're supposed to be working out of. Well, if they show up and that place is boarded up and you're not there, their big concern is, oh my gosh, I hope this isn't some kind of scam and they're improperly billing Medicare for services. We need to look at this and possibly revoke them because they're supposed to keep regular hours and have an official address.
And, you know, some of the ones that also to look at, the failure to report a final adverse action, or at the bottom, a Medicaid billing number has been revoked. In other words, you really want to be careful about bringing folk, if you know of those sorts of circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to make it onto the preclusion list. And the OIG, and the plan is going to find them sooner rather than later.
Yep.
And so even though you don't necessarily know they're on the preclusion list, but if you know they've had their Medicaid number revoked, you can be pretty sure that they're on the preclusion list or going to be on it pretty soon.
That's right. Next slide. Okay, this is a list of the current bases for revocation, okay? And all the blue ones are all the ones that were added when they added in a bunch of blue ones. The blue ones were added in 4 years ago. The reason I wanted to kind of put this on up here, is because they're going to get even broader, okay? And that's why I'm bringing this up today, because revocations are a big deal. That's typically what results in you being placed on the preclusion list.
Absolutely.
Next slide.
And you can see those blue ones, by the way, those blue ones were all added when they are about the same time as or contemporaneously with the creation of the preclusion list.
That's correct. That's right.
So they're while they're on the one hand trying to get out of the business of managed care,
Yep.
they're saying, well, but we're still in it.
Yep. Now, these are new proposed revocation authorities. These were proposed in August of this year. These are hot off the presses, guys. The big one for home health and hospice, non-compliance revocations. Essentially, under this basis, if you're audited by the state or by a UPIC, and they come in and they find that you are not fully meeting all of your enrollment requirements, that full panoply of requirements, guys, they can revoke you. And the reason they're adding this in, essentially they're going to modify one of the existing bases for revocation so that it's much broader. Before, it wasn't broad enough to catch any type of problem. Now it's going to be, extraordinarily broad. The second thing that they're doing is before, if you could be revoked if you had a felony within the last 10 years. Now they're changing that too, and now they're going to make it a misdemeanor. This is important, guys, because that means that if you've got an owner, a manager, or an officer, anyone in any kind of supervisory or management position that has a misdemeanor that CMS deems could be a problem, a risk to the integrity of the Medicare program, they can revoke you.
And this is really, to me, a brutal stretch, because it's not any misdemeanor qualifies you for a listing on the LEI, on the OIG's exclusion.
No, it's got to be healthcare related.
Got to be health
program related is what they use.
That's right. And here they're extending it to be any kind of action that CMS deems to be detrimental.
Yep.
And they can pretty much deem anything to be
That's
detrimental.
Right. Anything.
I mean,
you can even have a family a spousal abuse.
That's right. And then the CMS could say, well, this was an abuse, and this person might create a risk.
Shows how you treat people.
That's right. Abuse to a beneficiary. So it's an extraordinary, to me,
yes,
leap of intrusion into the process.
Kind of an overreaching of the enforcement process, frankly.
It seems to me very much.
I agree. Okay, next slide. Okay, some other things that they're going to be added. And understand, when they add these things, they propose it in quotes, okay, in August. But unless they were to get some type of really serious pushback from the industry or in the comments to these things, these are going to be enacted. Okay, False Claims Act judgment. Now this is one that is really problematic, except that it does not include False Claims Act settlement agreements, okay? But, so, once again, this is more pressure to settle False Claims Act cases, because if you take it to choo-choo and you lose, they can revoke you. You're out of business.
Yes. There's this whole, one of the things also, when a revocation proceeding is so where basically revocation is kind of a preventive action before you even get excluded, right?
That's
it's trying to keep you out of the program in the first place.
Yeah.
And so
only once kind of a thing.
That's right. We're not even going to let you go. And the administrative process in revocation is much different than the administrative processes for an exclusion.
Oh, yes, it is.
And so they not only, so when they add these things, they create, there's a much greater risk of harm. We
do a lot. We defend a lot of revocation actions, and knock on wood, we've got a good result with a lot of them. But still,
but it's really up to them. You have very little review.
You better have a good argument. That's all I can say.
And win at the first.
Okay, yeah. Violation of provider and supplier standards. That's kind of really focused mostly on the DME suppliers. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one. Debt referred to the U.S. Department of Treasury. See, it makes sense to me. The government is sick and tired of companies who come up with a huge debt, either through an administrative appeals process or some other kind of process, and then they walk away from that debt-ridden company, start a new one, and expect to be enrolled.
True, except that you can have, if you have an overpayment on a UPIC review or an audit, and they'll send that as a debt to the Treasury.
They will.
And then,
even though you're only halfway through your appeals process.
That's right. So that's problematic to me.
Yep. So anyway, debts are going to be a problem in the future, guys, and they can result in revocation, and a revocation can result in being placed on the preclusion list. That's a long way of saying that's one way to get on the preclusion list.
And by the way, be careful about debts, just as an aside, especially if it's a debt to the government for a loan, because that is a basis for exclusion, and they will process those.
Yes, they have. And you and I have handled exclusion cases based on the failure to repay a government loan.
And if you don't repay that loan, you can't get a job with the government either.
It's really,
not pass
really tough.
The clearance.
That's right. Next slide. All right, so we've talked about category 1, which was revocation. Category 2 this is the one that bothers me the most because it's so squishy. It's conduct-based, behavioral-based, okay? And under this one...
Without real standards.
That's right. Because if they say that an individual has engaged in behavior that if they had been enrolled, okay, CMS could have said, we would take action against you. It would have led to your revocation. Then we can take action against you.
So I still haven't figured out exactly how those things come up.
They find out that somebody has done something.
But then why would they? Maybe because they're related to somebody in the program?
Could be. It could be that they're applying for the first time. Let's say they're already in the program. It's time for re-enrollment.
Okay.
They properly disclose an adverse action on the application.
Right.
Okay. And let's say that they don't go after them for a failure to disclose it before because it's timely or whatever.
Because they've already disclosed it.
Yeah.
Oh, now they can go back.
They can go back.
Wow.
Yeah. So, this one, like I said, it's very squishy. It's basically, if you're not currently enrolled and you do something that if you were enrolled, we can take an action against you. Well, we can take an action against you.
Or if you are enrolled and we enrolled you, but we found out about it later.
Yes.
We could do it that way.
Right, because there's some adverse actions that really probably don't fall within the description of adverse action.
Correct.
But they're severe or detrimental enough to the agency, CMS thinks, that they would want to take an action against you.
Or suppose people related to someone who is excluded, they were part of it, but they didn't get the adverse action directly against them. They could use it that way. Very
possibly. So this is really kind of the definition of a bad actor, somebody that CMS doesn't like. Okay. All right. Next slide. All right. So we've kind of talked about what it takes to be on the preclusion list. Okay. But we've also talked about the fact that nobody has access to it except for law enforcement and the payers. Okay. So how in the world will an individual find out, Paul, if they're on the preclusion list?
Well, they will get notice and an opportunity to respond. They'll lose if they respond, but they do get notice. There is some process.
And there is an appeal process that they can avail themselves
And so I do think it's very important that your employment application, which should include, are you excluded? Have you have any adverse actions? Should include, have you been notified of the?
Have you been excluded? Are you currently, I'm sorry, have you been precluded? Are you currently on the preclusion list?
Or have you received notice?
Yeah.
And you're in the process.
Yeah. So, they're supposed to find out. Okay. And, once again, we talk about PACOS a lot. This is another reason why you got to keep that address right, because if you're a provider, and who are we talking about here? We could be talking about physicians. We could be talking about, anybody that's in the PACOS system. You have to have that address, and it's got to be accurate, because that's the address they're going to send this notice to.
And one of the problems with this is, though, since you're not in the program yet, you may get a letter that they may receive notice from CMS but they may not even realize what it is.
Because you haven't even applied to participate.
And you don't know the preclusion list, and you see this thing. And so I think that a large number of people who end up on the preclusion list have no idea that they're actually on it.
That's right. And the problem,
I don't read my mail, do you?
I actually do, Paul.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
The problem, though, is, let's say, for instance, the individual doesn't know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. A home health or hospice hires this nurse, and as we're going to talk about when we get to exclusions, who are most of the people on the exclusions?
Right.
Nurses, right?
Yeah.
So they hire this nurse. All right. Well, somehow this nurse now is going to be on the preclusion list, and how are they going to find out? Well, it's possible that there's the problem is it's going to be billed under the home health or hospice's number. If there's an audit and they find out that nurse is been providing care, now you got a problem.
I think I don't know how they're going to process that, to be honest, but it is problematic.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Next slide. Okay. All right. So we're going to look at three things here. We're going to look at a preclusion, as you mentioned in the very first minute of this presentation. Everybody on the exclusion list is also on the preclusion list, supposedly.
It's considered to be. Right. They're as if they are.
That's right. But interesting thing about it is the preclusion list and a revocation action associated with that has turned out in a weird way to be more serious almost than an exclusion. The exclusion, as we're going to talk about in 2 minutes or so, is really the nuclear bomb of all administrative sanctions.
Right.
But OIG, to their credit, even if it's a mandatory exclusion, most of the time, unless there's reasons to extend it, they get 5 years. They're excluded for 5 years. Is that correct? Would you agree with that?
I'd say yes.
It's a minimum of 5 years.
A minimum of 5 years.
And they don't typically go over it unless it's like lots of money or real bad or patients or whatever.
It depends. Licensing is one. Well, that's not even mandatory. But yes, it's 5 to 10. They at the end of the day, I think if the person rehabilitates themselves and they want them back in the program, because we need providers,
they'll let them back in. That's the problem with the revised revocation rules. Okay, ever since they came out, since 2019, is they went from a maximum of 3 years to 10 years. So, while it's not the nuclear bomb of exclusion, it can still make it to where, doctors and nurses and other healthcare providers, if you're revoked for 10 years, you're out of business essentially. You can't do Medicare or Medicaid or federal programs.
And we've both seen cases where someone who was excluded was reinstated by the OIG.
Yes.
Got their license back by whatever their physician license or whatever, got their license back, but CMS would still maintain the revocation.
Right. So even though OIG said, we're okay with you getting back in Medicare.
Yep.
CMS says no.
And the physician's licensing board says you can still practice medicine.
Yep. CMS
will say no.
All right. So real quick, if the preclusion is based on an exclusion, then when you're off of the exclusion list, you can probably get the preclusion lifted.
You're probably not on it's an extension. They don't actually add the names.
Right.
So they don't. So your preclusion is over. I would
essentially.
say. Essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Preclusion, if it's based on revocation, Well, you're going to be on it as long as you're revoked.
Absolutely.
Yep. Preclusion based on a felony conviction. Wow. Okay. Now, if it's a felony conviction, it's going to be a 10-year period beginning on the date of the felony conviction, unless CMS agrees to a shorter period.
So wouldn't even with if your preclusion is based on a revocation, the fact that the period has ended, the basis of it, whatever it was, you still have to get off the preclusion list. And CMS doesn't have to let you off, does it?
Well, that's a good question. We've never had a problem with getting people off it as soon as the revocation is listed, is lifted. We've never had a problem with that.
What if they don't want to lift the revocation? So the underlying event happened. You lost your license. You got it back. You were revoked on that basis.
Mm-hmm.
They still don't have to let you back in. They still don't have to let you off the list.
Well, that's even if they lift the revocation, enrollment is a completely separate issue. Okay.
That's true. So now you have to re-enroll.
You have to re-enroll. That's right.
Lifting the revocation is not re-enrollment.
That's right. That's not tantamount to just letting you back in the system. So that's the problem. Okay. That's a whole different mountain you got to deal with, and you're going to have to explain everything again, why you were revoked and all this kind of stuff. Next slide. Okay. All right. So can a home health agency, now you're the screening expert, okay, can a home health agency screen to make sure that their people are not on the preclusion list?
No, they really can't.
They really can't. There's no way to do that.
No access to the list.
But they need to be screening them anyway for exclusion.
Absolutely.
Okay, next slide. Okay, credentialing. What role does credentialing play? Well, credentialing is this is something that for the home health and hospice agencies there, if you're going to be credentialing, I strongly recommend that you get a company that you work with that is an expert in credentialing. Because if you leave something off, we have seen, even if you disclose it in one area, but you check no in another area, and we've had 2 or 3 of those cases recently where someone admitted that they had been convicted of a felony, but then they checked no later on, and they included documentations of the felony and everything. It caused all kinds of problems.
Insanity, in my view.
So be very careful about that. Next slide.
And so, this is really directly where the preclusion comes in, because when you seek to credential your people with your managed care entity, that's when
you're going to find out, hey, you can't hire them.
Right. They're going to, now the problem is you don't credential everybody, and so you don't, if you were credentialing everybody, or if they were screening all the employees with the preclusion list, which perhaps they ought to, that's a different story.
Yeah, but they don't. So I don't, it's really difficult for home health and hospice. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this presentation, because you guys really cannot fully protect yourself from the preclusion problems because you're not sending an entire list of all your employees over to the payers that I know of.
Right.
And that changes. I mean, Lord knows though.
Well, they push down that obligation, and you don't have access to the.
That's right.
To the preclusion list.
Yeah. Next slide. But if they did send that over, then the payer at least could check it.
That's right.
Yeah. But they don't. Okay. All right. So how do you appeal it? Well, there is an appeal process that you can go through. We've handled a number of these appeals. There's an administrative process. It ultimately can go in front of an ALJ, and then eventually go to the Departmental Appeals Board, which is at the same level as the Medicare Administrative. I'm sorry, the Medicare Appeals Council, the MAC. The government uses. They have so many acronyms that they actually use them for 2 different or 3 different reasons now. The Medicare Appeals Council, it's at the same level. And then after that, you can go to federal court. Next slide.
But you can't win at any of them, can you?
Yes. I mean, yes, we have.
On a preclusion? Because it's really difficult.
It's very difficult.
Because some of it is so subjective.
That's the problem. I mean, it's very hard, especially on the revocation side, because if you're revoked or you're not.
Right.
On the behavioral conduct side, Sometimes you can actually, once you start through the administrative appeals process and you get to the point to where, which is right before an ALJ, you're talking to CMS's attorney, okay?
That's where you have a shot?
Yeah, that's where you have a shot, because if you have equitable arguments that you can bring up at that point, then you got a shot possibly, okay? All right, so now we're on to exclusion. That's the preclusion side of our presentation. Now let's talk about exclusions, Paul.
All righty then. So,
Long history of exclusions, aren't there?
The idea of that we want to keep certain bad actors out of our Medicare and Medicaid programs has been around, since 1977.
Yep.
So it's not like this is anything new. It's gradually increased. At first it was doctors, and then it increased, and now. With the 1999 and then the 2013 special advisories on the impact of it, it's basically expanded to anybody that is on anybody that provides any service, item or service, whether directly or indirectly, to a Medicare or healthcare benefit program, which includes Medicaid, CHIPS, the VA, and of course Medicare. They cannot participate in those programs.
Yeah.
And there's a logic to that.
There is. Next slide. Okay, so what are the two types of exclusions? I mean, it comes in two flavors, doesn't it?
Two flavors. One is the mandatory exclusions. There are only 4 bases for that, which are basically healthcare fraud, any kind of healthcare fraud conviction.
And that's felony or misdemeanor.
That's correct. Certain drug offenses, certain drug offenses, patient abuse, and basically it. Permissive, permissive is all of the other, a lot of the things that you're talking about in revocations. It's conduct based, but the main lists are licensing. That comprises about 70%. Those are not considered mandatory. The difference between mandatory and permissive. Mandatory sounds like they're supposed to, and I think they are supposed to, but they don't really follow through with mandatory.
No, mandatory they have to.
But they don't. They have to, but they don't. So but they don't because they don't get all the information necessarily.
Oh, okay. But if they know of it, they have, it's mandatory by statute.
If they know of it.
That's the issue.
Right. But they don't.
But the problem is, we've had cases where they didn't find out about it until years after the fact, and then they went back and they started it now.
You do that.
And that's a real problem because, these poor docs are like, hey, I was convicted 10 years ago, and you're just now starting that my 5-year period now.
Essentially mandatory. If they start it, they will win because it's conduct based and it's conviction based. It's actually a finding based.
Yeah, and you cannot go back and relitigate the conviction.
No. Permissive is for 3 years.
At minimum.
It says at minimum, 3+, they may, but if it's certain conduct, they will. Yeah. Which is licensing.
And we're going to talk about those different categories in a second. But the important thing here for home health and hospice, most of the people on the exclusion list are nurses.
Are people who are provided direct hands-on to patients. That's who they're looking at. And that's nurses, CNAs, or any kind of support person.
And that's a sweet spot for our clients here that we're talking about.
And in home health, it can be whether they're actually a nurse or whether it's just a home care provider. Yep. But anybody that's touching or going into the home of a beneficiary, that's a target.
And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that everybody on this call screen every month, especially in Texas, and that's what we're talking about, because in Texas, of course, as part of the Medicaid participation agreement, you swear that you're checking that and all the other states every 30 days.
That's right. Yeah, you certify. And remember that
next slide.
A lot of people, that last tag said admission is not, readmission is not automatic. When that 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, whatever that period of time is up, and a lot of people think, oh, well, my time is up and it's okay.
Oh, yeah, I can go back on. I can go back to work.
But that's not the case.
No, you have to affirmatively go in and you have to tell it. Now, here's why you have to affirmatively go in. It's very interesting when you think about it. Let's say that you've got a doctor or a nurse. Let's say a nurse, since we're talking home health. got a nurse who's been on the exclusion list for quite a while. And let's say she went on in 2015 for 5 years.
Okay.
Her 5 years is long up, right? It's very understandable for that nurse to think, well, my 5 years is up. I'm not a problem. I can go to work for you. Wrong.
And you know what? There's a lot of people who may have been on that list from 15 years back, and they actually either forgot that they were on the list, or it's so far back they think that it has to have been over with, so they don't report it.
And here's the problem. Let's say she didn't go back to work for a company that takes Medicare until 2018.
Right.
Okay. She does that all these years. She is still on the list. When she has to fill out that application to get off the list, one of the things that they're going to ask her is, what have you been doing from the moment you were on the list? And if she has to put on there that she's been working for your home health or hospice, now all of a sudden they're going to hit you with huge penalties.
You are a great
And they're probably not going to agree to let her off the list. She cannot be working. Anyone that is excluded, I don't care how long it's been back there, they have to affirmatively get off the list. They cannot work for any provider who takes federal health benefit program beneficiaries. Period.
And by the way, and this is the part that really I think is kind of unfair. I don't know, but you can't. You have to affirmatively get off the list. You can't just say, I'm not going to practice. I'm not going to be involved in Medicare anymore.
Right,
I'm not going to be involved in Medicaid anymore. I want to do this other job. And
you are kryptonite to any practice.
That's right. And you are kryptonite to anybody that is connected to a practice. So
you cannot even. Let's say that you've got students who want to come in and do an internship for you. If they are on that exclusion list, you can be hit with huge penalties for even letting them in the door to help take care of your patients. Okay,
if they're
volunteers that are not being paid are covered.
As long as they're providing any part of a basket of services, and anybody that comes in the door in this sort of circumstance is providing something that's covered.
That's right. Next slide. Okay. Let me back up for 1 second here. Background checks. I know all of you in Texas do a background check, and you'll say, well, we do a background check. What's the problem? No, a background check is not the same as checking someone on the exclusion list. They are very, very different. And if you've heard our other presentations on background checks, you'll know that background checks, there are companies out there today that will give you alibis, references, addresses, everything, even degrees. Make it up in whole cloth for $200 or $300.
Right. They'll give you the whole works. You just tell them what you want.
Background checks are worthless, unfortunately, but they are still required in Texas.
So and also even a good even someone that's not a crook but are doing a real background check, they don't have access to all of the exclusion list.
No.
Because they have. I shouldn't say they don't have access. They have access to them, but they're really hard to find. They're in different formats.
And if they tell you, but I'm checking Texas,
right?
That's not good enough. And even in Texas says you have to check all states.
It does.
Yep. Louisiana says it's actually a crime if you don't.
But it's a crime if actually it turns out that an excluded person is providing a service. That person is convicted.
Yeah, they criminalized it.
It's criminal.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about this a little bit. What we haven't talked about though is vendors and contractors. Can you kind of address that, Paul?
Well, so it's not just your direct employees. It's everyone you do business with. They don't want anybody going around to make an end around of the process. So that, let's say your billing company, right? If you've got a third party biller and that biller is excluded, okay? Well, they're providing a service that it's a third party. Well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is,
or a therapy company for these guys.
Therapy company or a staffing agency.
Staffing is huge problem.
The biggest, probably for your folks, the biggest problem would be staffing agencies. You bring somebody in, they'll tell you that they've screened me,
or they've done a background,
or they did whatever. But the fact is that you have to check anybody that's directly or indirectly. So if it's like you have an outside IT someone that provides your IT services that's outside the agency, they are indirectly definitely supporting your program. So you've got to do your employees, your direct employees, as well as the people that you do business with, your vendors and contractors. Now, we get asked, well, what do we have to do waste management?
I know you guys have a whole presentation on vendors and contractors. Which ones do you have to screen? Which ones do you not have to screen?
Right. And I think the rule of, to make it, for these purposes today, we'll talk about, use the rule of reason. If they're, and the reason is, are they coming into your facility? Are they looking at your patients? Are they, if you were a nursing home, are they coming in and are they removing the red boxes or not? Are they, or are they just outside?
Yeah, is it just the trash company that empties your dumpster?
Is it the phone company? Somebody
the
like
electric
that?
company. You wouldn't have to do them.
Whereas is it
FedEx.
someone that's providing, a service? Are they providing your if you were a nursing home or something like that, are they providing your linens? Are they providing things like that?
Yeah.
So use the reason. Do they affect billing, or do they affect the beneficiary?
But one safe way to do it, though, let's just say the linens, or let's just say it's someone picking up the red boxes, the waste
Sharps containers.
Sharps containers. Theoretically, the Sharps people are supposed to be checking their own folks.
That's right.
And there's no way you can check 20,000 of their employees, and you're not expected to. What you are expected to do, though, is check the company itself, and you need to make sure that you tell them, hey, you're checking your folks, right? So I don't have to do it.
And I think it is fair, if you have a contractual relationship with someone, to say that it is your responsibility to be screening your employees as independent contractors, because I can't do it.
Next slide. All right, so let's kind of compare exclusion list versus preclusion list. The exclusion list, it's either mandatory or permissive, and there's actually something concrete that you can actually point to, right? And it would cover anybody doing any program. It would even cover people that are convicted of healthcare fraud and they didn't take any federal money at all.
Right.
Okay.
And it's a list you can see. It's a list that's up there. There's 70,000 or 75,000 names on that list. You can see who they are. When they come off the list. Some states will keep you on the list even though you,
like Florida, and it's a real pain. So the exclusion list then is a list of folks that have been excluded from participation in federal health care programs. Okay. The preclusion list is only a list of folks, providers and suppliers, who are prohibited from enrolling or re-enrolling in Part C and Part D. Period.
Yeah.
That's it. Next slide. Okay, and the purpose? What's the purpose of the OIG exclusion list?
Well, the OIG,
and there's two purposes, right?
Right. I think the main purpose is to enforce this concept of there are certain people who have been determined, they're administratively been determined to be to be a risk to the program, the financial of the program, and to the beneficiaries.
That's right.
We have a determination of that. And so they can't be in the program. They can't participate directly or indirectly.
But what I like about the exclusion list, though, is it's based on something concrete.
Right.
Every time. Either loss of license, failure to repay a loan, felony conviction, a misdemeanor program-related conviction, something that you can actually point to. Now,
there are a bunch of those conduct-related matters involved for the exclusion list. But they have when those come up, they can litigate those, and they're very rare. They're very small percentage.
Very, very. I mean, like you said, 70% of all the people on the exclusion list are nurses.
Right.
And most of those are related to licensure.
Right. So.
Preclusion list, once again, it's bad actors. For most of them, you can actually point to something concrete, a revocation. But for the others, it's kind of squishy. We talked about that.
And I think it's purpose. Why would they use that? So
I think it's the same purpose, really, to protect. Don't forget, folks, that even though Part C and Part D are private companies, okay, they are paid a capitation rate, on the Part C side, for each Medicare or Medicaid patient that signs up for it. And on the drug side, they're paid, it's all reimbursed by the feds. So I think it's to protect the program and the people.
But I think that I think its purpose, at least part of the purpose, is to fill the gap that the private insurers don't have access to the information
Yeah.
that CMS has access to. And so they are, and so they're trying to beef up their, because this is what the CMS would be using this if they still were credentialing people for the program.
Good point.
But since they've handed it over to the insurance companies, they're trying to fill that gap, what they would know. But I don't think it adequately does that.
No.
I think that's its, quote, purpose.
Right. Next slide. Okay, who has access? The exclusion list, the problem with the exclusion list is it's publicly accessible, okay? But the problem though is that like in Texas, you're expected not just to look at the OIG list and the Texas Medicaid list. In Texas, you're expected to look at all states. Well, there's currently 42 or 43 states that have Medicaid lists, okay? It's a mess. It's physically impossible for you to do that, which is why, of course, we recommend that you contact Exclusion Screening because they do it for very cheap and it's, very comprehensive.
And by the way, they also, the most Medicaid managed care will require, I think they actually do, not most, but they all do require that you screen what's called the GSA SAM, the General Services Administration, whatever that is.
So while theoretically, home health and hospice agencies could, in fact, check all the lists for exclusion, they don't even have access to the list for preclusion. They just have to find out from the employee, or they have to get a denial, I guess, from the insurance agency.
But it does make sense to though be a little more proactive. I think the suggestion is that one of the takeaways from my perspective is that the home health and hospice ought to be a little more proactive in their credentialing process, because it used to be you could rely on CMS to do that, and you were contracting with CMS and they credentialed them, and so there it was. But now that you're responsible for the credentialing process and you're the one that has the relationship with the contractor, I think you really need to be a little more proactive in determining who you're allowing in, and to be aware of this preclusion list and trying to ferret out whether people are on it.
Yep. Next one. Okay, the size of the database. Okay, well, this is as of March 22. I think you've got some later numbers, but the numbers are pretty static, aren't they? Probably 75 to 80,000.
Yep.
And then an additional 80,000 or 85,000, maybe 100,000 on the state databases, and then 144,000 on the GSA debarment list. Now, let's talk real quick about that. That's something that OIG says you need to be checking.
Well, actually, CMS is saying that you need to be checking. OIG is kind of funny about that.
They kind of go back and forth.
They do, because at one point they said, well, we don't have authority to make you do that, but now when you sign a CIA, they make people.
That's right. And a debarment list is a lot broader than an exclusion list, because it's like it's kind of like the bad actor list again. These are people that any agency, any federal agency can say, you know what, we don't want to do business with you anymore.
It's a pretty funky list to me, to be honest.
Yep.
Just for that reason. And so, but your Medicaid managed care who you probably you're probably a provider for.
Yep.
They require that you screen the GSA.
Yep.
And so, and
you need to do it every 30 days,
month,
guys. Unfortunately, and it makes sense, because you could have and we've represented people in South Texas who, when they hired the person, they were not on the exclusion list. 60 days later, they were.
Oh, that happens with some level of frequency, that people are they've been excluded, or they're in the process. They get fired from where they are, and they know they're in the process, so they can't get there. So they go someplace else, and they say, I'm not currently excluded, and they technically are not. And then we find out, and that's
the other problem we run across with home health and hospice too, is you should have a question on your application. Are you currently excluded? Have you been excluded?
Absolutely.
Both of those. If they lie, and understand, if they don't lie, they won't get the job. If they're excluded and they lie, and there's not much you can do about it. That's why you have to be checking this stuff, because we've had so many cases where the people lie, and we ask them, why'd you lie? Well, if I lied, or if I told them the truth and told them I was excluded, They wouldn't give me the job.
We also have an equal number of people who have not added that to their employment list, to their questionnaire.
Yes,
And so
yes. And they didn't lie because they were never asked the
well,
question.
I asked them, but it's not actually on the
That's
application.
right. Okay, so that's a pretty significant list on the exclusion side. On the preclusion side, like you said, it's only about 4,500, 4,600. Theoretically, you have all the folks on the exclusion list, but they don't really add those over. But once again, you guys on the phone today don't have the ability to access that list. Next slide. Okay, the benefits.
Penalties.
Gosh, on the exclusion side, if you hire someone who is excluded, okay, you can just think about it this way. Everything they're associated with is tainted. Now, if they're a direct biller, that's one way that they calculate the penalties they're going to go after. If they're an indirect biller, doesn't mean you're off the hook, okay? They're still going to go after you. And
they have a formula.
They do have a formula.
And so you think, oh, well, it's on your payer mix and so forth. But if you've had that employee for a number of years, that formula can add up to quite a bit of money.
A lot of money. It absolutely can.
And the formula only exists, by the way, if you self-report. If you don't self-report and they find out about it, then all those claims are tainted.
Yes, they are. All right. So penalties, they can go after you on the preclusion side, for civil monetary penalties. Not something we've seen a lot of. It's the kind of thing where CMS has really kind of been a little bit hands off on that. And I think it's because, I don't think they want to create a lot of bad law. How can you go after these poor agencies for employing someone on the preclusion list if you don't give them access to the list?
Right. I think that the Part C, what happens, the Part C and Part D are supposed to be screening and they don't. And so they don't and there is they could actually pay if they pass through, the penalties can be severe, but CMS just has never gone after that.
They really haven't. Next slide. Okay, the length of the sanction, we talked about this already with exclusions. On the mandatory side, it's a minimum of 5 years.
Nice slide, Robert.
Thank you. And on the permissive side, it's a minimum of 3 years. When it comes to preclusion, it's 1 to 10 years. Okay. Well, that's not true. It's as long as it depends on it depends on what it is. If it's based on exclusion, it's the same as the exclusion.
Right.
If it's based on a revocation, it's the same as the revocation. And if it's based on the felony, it's up to 10 years.
Do they pull you off when the revocation is up?
No. We have, that's a great question, Paul. The Federal Register does not say whether they do or not. I will tell you that our practice has been, and we've gotten a couple people where we got them removed, but we affirmatively went in and said, we got the revocation revoked. Okay. Now they were still revoked for a certain period. So that was a bona fide revocation while it was in place, but we got that pulled back. And then we said, since that's been pulled back, we want you to now take them off the preclusion list.
But like with the exclusion list, if you don't go in,
well, theoretically, CMS is supposed to tell them, and then 30 days later, they would come off the preclusion list. We don't wait. We don't wait.
Have you seen the notices from CMS saying that your preclusion is up?
No, they don't send it to us because we'd only send it to the.
And maybe they do and maybe they don't.
Who knows? So that's why we just go out of our way and, belt and suspenders. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked about how many people are on the list. The big kahuna is the exclusion list. And that's so important that you guys are screening every 30 days because if you don't, the penalties are outrageous. Does one take precedent over the other?
No, I mean, they're just separate.
Freestanding, aren't they? And you could have one and not the other, or both. And
the Texas list too. I actually did an analysis of the Texas list. Just don't think that you can only do the OIG exclusion list that if they're excluded, whether or not they'll be from Texas. As someone if they're not on the exclusion list, they won't be on the Texas list. That's not the case. I have seen a number of cases where people have been excluded from Texas. and the names or they did not get over to the LEIE, even though they absolutely would have qualified.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, Paul, we've been doing this a long time.
Too long.
You know, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, the left hand and the right hand didn't know what each other were doing. That has changed. Used to be, we would tell people, if you're suspended, for instance, if you're suspended from Medicare, you can still see Medicare patients, you can still bill for Medicare patients, but any money is going to go over into an escrow account, right? But we would say that probably won't impact Advantage, probably won't impact Medicaid. Those days are over. Now, you know, the left hand and the right hand are talking. And if you're suspended for one, then you're going to be likely you're likely to be suspended from the other.
So the Affordable Care Act says that when a state excludes somebody or terminates them, if that termination or exclusion is for cause, they're required to send that information to the LIE, which is required to process it for exclusion. You know, there have been studies of that, and states are better, but that does not always happen by any means.
Yeah, so that's why you can't just rely on the LEIE, because the states are not doing their jobs. The other problem is, now, God bless you in Texas. I'm a Texan, born and probably die there. But, you know, right now I'm up here.
Up here, jungle.
Yeah, you know, Paul, when we go to lunch, we go from D.C. to Virginia to Maryland, all in the same, all at lunch. You know what I'm saying? There have been situations that we've seen where someone has been, they've had their license suspended in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
They step across the state line and they get a job in Maryland. And it takes a long, you know, the boards don't talk to each other like they should always. And, you know, the problem is, that's a perfect example why you have to check other states, because a bad actor could walk away from something bad in Pennsylvania and go to Texas.
And this particularly happens with nurses or support people. They get excluded from one, or they get.
And God bless them, they're just trying to work. I understand that, but they can't do that.
No, they can't. And you really do need to check all the states. The compact is not. It doesn't happen instantaneously. Every state has its own process, and you know we know many cases where they're excluded from one and not from another, or in process from another. They get their license back in this state, but they still don't have it. On and on.
Yep. What any questions that we haven't answered so far? Does placement on the list cover Medicare and Medicaid? Well, for the exclusion list, it absolutely does, and it covers far more than that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There was all federal healthcare benefit programs,
which includes Medicaid and any program that gets any state dollar.
You know, that's the problem with being excluded. You can still get your license back. You may not ever even, you know, you may have a conviction or some action that results in a conviction. You don't do time. You may not even lose your license depending on the state, but you cannot work for not only can you not take Medicare, you can't work for anyone that takes Medicare, Medicaid, or any other federal health benefit program, period.
A Medicaid termination or exclusion will eventually result on listing on the feds and on all the other states.
But, you know, that's a should.
And it may and it may not. So,
and that's the other weird part about this. It makes it really difficult for you guys to check, is that some states call exclusions, and some states call them what, Paul?
They call them terminations, they call them sanctions, they call them suspensions,
they call them
debarments.
It's just crazy at the state level. It really is the Wild West. And that's why you really need to be very, very careful, because what you don't want to do is you check the LEIE and it's clear. And you don't check all states, and then you find out later on that there was a bad guy that came to you from Wyoming or from some other weird state that you never would have checked. And it turns out that, you know, they engaged, and think about this from a liability standpoint, guys. What if they engaged in some type of patient abuse and they lost their license, okay? And they were placed on the state exclusion list, whatever they call it, okay? And you hire them, and then they do something horrible with a patient. My gosh, the fact that you did not check those state lists, you have set yourself up for a huge lawsuit.
Absolutely.
So I think that's it. Next slide. There we go. If you have any questions about exclusion screening, you can go to their website directly, or as always, if you have questions about health law, you can give me a call
There is one question, Robert.
at Liles Parker.
How do we perform background checks in all the states?
Oh my God, I don't have an answer for that. I don't think that you can. There may be now, if you're talking about background checks, of course, that's, I don't know. You have to ask a background company.
But
If you're really asking about exclusions,
well, then
you know,
you need a third party.
you got to get a third party like exclusion screening.
Right.
They will check all states for you, and they will check the SAM, and they will check the LEIE, and they'll do it every month.
Yep.
Okay. Cheaper than what you're paying for water.
Always. Not even close.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions there? All right.
So all the questions are just about AMBO credits and.
Okay.
extensions.
All right.
Okay. All right. Paul, do you have any final remarks?
No, thank you for inviting me, Robert. Always a pleasure to do webinars with you.
Well, I appreciate it, Paul. I mean, you're the one person in the country that keeps up with all these exclusion issues, so I always like having you here.
All right, my pleasure.
Okay.
And to everybody else, good luck. Have a nice day.
And have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us for this Wednesday webinar for the Texas Association for the Home Care and Hospice. And thank you to our first speakers today, Robert Liles and Paul Weidenfeld. And everyone who attended today will receive an email tomorrow with a copy of the presentation. Have a good Wednesday, guys.